Ever seen a wildlife photo where the background looks super smooth and blurry and thought to yourself, how do they get that? Today I'll show you exactly how to get that kind of blurry background even if you're just starting out. I am Shantanu and today we are talking about something that can instantly make your wildlife photos look better. Getting that clean blurry background, also known as bokeh. And the good news is you don't need expensive gear or complicated settings to blur your background. It's just a few simple principles. And once you understand how they work, your subjects will start popping out of the frame effortlessly. By the end of this video, you will exactly know what creates that background blur, what controls it, and how you can use it to create beautiful wildlife photos. Background blur is neither magic nor a trick. In principle, it's just your background being out of focus. See, when you focus on the subject, everything behind that subject naturally starts to fall out of focus. And that's what creates the background blur. So, if this is your camera and this is your subject, the moment you focus on the subject, your camera creates this invisible flat block around what you focused on. And this block is called the depth of field. Anything inside this block will be reasonably sharp, not just the subject. Anything that happens to fall in this region will appear to be in focus and sharp. And anything outside this depth of field will be out of focus. So really, the whole idea is very simple. Wherever you choose to focus, your camera creates a block of sharpness, known as the depth of field. And everything that isn't inside that zone slowly falls out of focus. And that's what gives you the blur. Now, the intensity of that blur is something you can actually control. Once you understand what affects this intensity, you'll be able to create those buttery smooth backgrounds with ease. The amount of blur you get is not random. It depends on four things. And the first, and probably the most important one, is your aperture. See, aperture is simply the opening that controls how much light enters your lens. The bigger the aperture, the more light gets in. The smaller the aperture, the less light enters. This is shown using F numbers. A smaller F number means a bigger opening, and a bigger F number means a smaller opening. Now, besides controlling light, aperture also decides how much of the scene is in focus. So let's go back to our diagram for a moment. Remember the depth of field? That block sitting around what you focused on? With a wide or a big aperture, that depth of field block becomes very thin. At f2.8, for example, the depth of field is razor thin. Your subject stays sharp and anything behind it starts falling out of focus with distance. And that's what creates that strong, smooth background blur. Now, with a smaller or narrower aperture, the depth of field becomes thicker. As you move to f8 or f9, more of the scene now fits inside the depth of field. So more of the background stays in focus and the blur becomes weaker. Let's quickly see this in action. I've got this little Thanos dummy as a subject and I'm using a 70 to 200 mm lens at 200 mm. Right now, my aperture is f22 and as you can see, the background has a lot of detail and very less blur. Don't mind the noise as I'm shooting indoors and the light is scarce. Now carefully watch what happens as I open up the aperture and drop it to f2.8. See how the background progressively gets softer and smoother? That's simply the depth of field block getting thinner and thinner. So aperture is literally your blur controller. Wide aperture is equal to more blur and narrow aperture is equal to less blur. The key takeaway is simple. If you want smooth background blur, shoot at the widest aperture your lens allows. The lower the f number, the stronger the blur. And work with what you have. There's a myth in wildlife photography that strong blur only comes from lenses that have very wide apertures like f2.8 or f1.4. Yes, those lenses definitely enhance the effect, but you can still get a beautifully soft background even with f5.6 or 6.3. You don't need the most expensive lens to get those smooth backgrounds, and I'll show you exactly how to achieve great blur with whatever gear you have. The next most important thing that controls your blur is how far the background is from the subject. The farther the background is, the more blur you'll get. It's really that simple. Now let's go back to our diagram again. See, blur doesn't happen instantly behind the depth of field. It's gradual. which means that things that are just a little behind your subject will only blur a little, and things which are way farther behind will blur a lot. So, if your background has objects that sit very close to the subject, they will appear stronger and more defined in the frame. But the elements that are way behind will melt away completely. Let's look at an example. We still have our little Thanos dummy, but this time I've placed a few objects right behind him. They're so close that even at my widest aperture, the background doesn't look creamy. You can clearly make out the shapes because they're practically touching the subject. Now watch what happens as I start moving these objects farther and farther away. Here they are shifted just a little. Now a little more. And now even more after that. Notice how with every bit of extra distance the background starts getting softer and smoother. That's because blur builds gradually. The farther something is from the subject, the more it melts away. And finally, here's what happens when I remove the objects altogether and let the background sit naturally far behind the subject. See, instantly the frame becomes creamy and smooth. Not because of a different lens or some complicated settings, but simply because the background is now much, much farther away. That's all it is, distance. In wildlife photography, how far the subject is from the background is not always under your control. But this knowledge helps you spot the right opportunities. Now, once you understand that background separation creates stronger blur, you will naturally start noticing situations where the animal is well away from the trees or the bushes behind it. And that's when you try for those creamy, blurry shots. Now, here are a few things that can help you in the field. Number one, change your angle. Look around and find the angle where the background is farthest from the subject. Move the vehicle if you can. Even small shifts in angle can dramatically increase the separation between the subject and the background. Number two, shoot from a lower angle whenever possible. Shooting from a lower angle often pushes the background farther away, especially if the ground dips or the animal is on a slightly raised patch. And now that you understand that separation from the background is an absolute requirement for getting those dreamy, blurry shots, here's something that will save you a lot of frustration. You cannot blur the background in every single shot. Even the best wildlife photographers can't. If the background is very close to the subject, you will never get a soft buttery blur, no matter what lens or camera you use. The key is to know when a shot has potential for that smooth background and when it doesn't. Now, the third factor that affects your background blur is how far you are from the subject. And here's the simple rule. The closer you are to the subject, the stronger the background blur. The farther you are, the weaker the blur becomes. Why? Because depth of field is directly linked to your focusing distance. The closer you focus, the thinner your depth of field. And the farther you focus, the thicker it becomes. So even though you don't change your aperture, just moving closer to the subject reduces your depth of field and makes the background blur much, much stronger. Let me show this to you with Thanos. See, if I stand far away and take a shot at say f2.8, the background will have more details because the depth of field is thicker at that distance. But if I simply walk closer to the subject and take the exact same shot at the same aperture, the background becomes noticeably softer. Nothing changed except my distance, and that alone increased the blur. Now, this is the same reason why portrait photographers always step close to their subjects. Close focusing distance is equal to a thinner depth of field and a stronger blur. Now, in wildlife photography, you obviously can't get super close to the subject, but you can still use the same principle. See, the goal is to fill more of your frame with the animal. And one of the ways to do it is just by increasing your zoom, provided you're using a zoom lens. And obviously, you can also try and get close to your subject, but make sure you never disturb the animal and also ensure it is totally safe for you to do so. What works mostly for me is just waiting. Sometimes animals like tigers, lions do come close to your vehicle. All you have to do is wait. So the key takeaway here for you is that the closer the subject is to you, the blurrier the background will look, even if the other settings remain the same. The fourth factor that affects your background blur is your focal length, or how zoomed in your lens is. And the rule is extremely simple. The more you zoom in, the stronger the background blur. The wider you shoot, the weaker the blur becomes. And the reason is simple. See, when you zoom in, you're not just zooming on your subject, you're also zooming in on the background. And if the background is already blurred a little, zooming in magnifies that blur. So the same amount of blur suddenly looks much stronger at longer focal lengths. Let me show this to you with Thanos. See, here's a shot at 200 mm at 2.8. And here's the exact same shot at 400 mm also at 2.8. Same subject, same aperture. But the background blur at 400 mm looks dramatically stronger. And this is why wildlife photographers love longer lenses. A long focal length can give you a beautifully blurred background simply because you're magnifying whatever blur is already there. So always remember, if you want creamy, smooth backgrounds, zoom in whenever possible. Longer focal lengths naturally exaggerate blur. Now, we've looked at each factor individually, but in real photography, they rarely work alone. Your blur becomes truly powerful when all four of them stack together. When I was starting out, I genuinely believed that great background blur only comes from expensive lenses which have super wide apertures like 2.8 or 1.4. And honestly, how wrong was I? Yes, wider apertures help, and more expensive lenses do make things easier. But they are not the only thing that decides how beautiful your background blur will look. Blur is created by a combination of four things: your aperture, the distance between your subject and the background, how close you are to the subject, and the focal length you're shooting at. All four matter. And when they work together, you can get incredible blur even when your lens is not top tier or high end. Let me prove this to you. Here are two photos of the Thanos dummy. Two different lenses, two completely different apertures. One of these lenses is extremely expensive and the other is much more affordable. And yet, look at the backgrounds. The blur is almost the same. Can you tell which photo was shot with the expensive lens? Most people can't. Neither can I. So remember, you don't need the most expensive lens or the perfect gear to create that background blur. Wider aperture lenses help, but they don't alone decide everything. What really matters is your understanding of how blur works, and now you do. So, get safely close to your subject. Use longer focal lengths whenever possible. Make sure your background is far behind the subject. And shoot at the widest aperture your lens allows. Do these four things and you'll consistently get that smooth, blurry background in your photos. And that's it. I hope this video helped you finally understand what creates that background blur and how you can control it in your wildlife shots. If you found this helpful, hit that like button and consider subscribing. If you want to check out some of my photography work, this is my Instagram handle. I'll see you in the next one.